Always says, kuziwa zvauri kuziwa kugara, nzira inokusvitsa kwaunobva. Translated, this means to know who you are is to know how you live. The path will always lead you back to where you come from. Now, this is very true for me, because growing up, my father was a diplomat. I did not grow up in Zimbabwe. I grew up everywhere else but here. And because of that, my father was very strict about teaching me culture. When I was a little girl, he would tell me nganos. Ngano is ancient folklore. It's a tradition and a custom of ours, where our grandparents or parents sit on a chair, the children sit on a floor, and they tell you folklore. And the folklore they tell you always has a lesson. There's always a moral to the story. And that's part of the way of the ancients, how they raised the children. They would raise them through the oral tradition. Because I'm sure many of you have tried to lecture a child, and what do? The opposite. If you say don't do this, they'll do the opposite. However, if you tell them a story where they see the consequences, they may stop and think for a little while. They could still do it, or they could not, but your chances are a bit higher. Now, when he was doing this, I never understood the importance of it until much later. Every single weekend, I would have history lessons on Zimbabwe in general. And you can imagine I'm in grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, and I'm like, can this man give me a break? I want to go outside and play. I don't want to hear about this. But he was adamant. I'm the last born. Everybody else had some time in Zimbabwe. I didn't. And what he would always say is, I want you to be able to stand proud in your culture and in your heritage in front of other people, because you have a passion for wanting to know about other people's culture, but you need to know your own first. There's no point in you knowing everything about the Japanese culture, and yet when you're asked about yours, you're blank. So he was like, this is the importance of what I'm teaching you. You may not see it now, but at some point, you will understand. Now, when I came back to Zimbabwe, I came back when I was 13, 14, and that's when the disconnect happened. There was a slight disconnect from culture and myself. First of all, the books I was reading, there were no representation of someone like me, and yet I was in Zimbabwe. Everything I read, there was literally no representation, so I couldn't connect to it. These are things that were not part of our culture, so I couldn't connect to it. In actual fact, growing up, there were times when I felt like I was being made to feel ashamed of my culture. Now, as children, you're very impressionable. So it did its number on me. And I was like, yeah, I'm proud to be Zimbabwean, kinda, maybe, on some days. And that was around the time when I was 14, I wrote a poem about suicide. I contemplated it. And I remember my father got very, very shaken. He gave me an hour-long lecture in his office, and then he went on to tell me how much I was loved and how devastating that would be to everybody else. Now, that's when he said, it's important for you to always write, always express yourself in some way. If you struggle, write a letter, slip it under my door. I'll read it. And that's how I began writing. Now, documenting things is also an ancient custom of ours. They used to do it on rock paintings very, very often. The rock paintings tell a story. I think there's no rock formation monument or place that does not have rock painting of some sort. And then there was the oral tradition, and then there was kudetemba, which is spoken word poetry. It is another way that they would tell stories. These are ancient customs and traditions of ours that predate pre-colonialism hundreds of years ago. Now, as I began to do that, I began to get back deeper into culture. Now, in Zimbabwe, we have 16 official languages, if I'm not mistaken. And most of these represent different tribes. I am of the Karanga tribe, which is mainly found in the Masvingo area. Now, one thing that disconnected me from my culture was there was always a form of, can I say bullying? Where people would look down on people from Masvingo, they make jokes. So immediately you don't want to be associated because you become part of the joke. But then my dad was like, listen, I'm a very intelligent man. You know, I've worked for many organizations, not just the government. You know, I have been influential in many treaties, and yet I am from Masvingo, and I am not embarrassed about it. So why should you be? So my teen years had a lot of back and forth. And then when I began to really understand the importance of representation and preserving culture was when I was 23 and my father passed on. The only way I could articulate myself was through writing. The only way. There was no other way I could do it. And there is a culture in Zimbabwe, and I don't really like this culture, but when somebody dies, everyone tells you, oh, be strong, it's everyone's path. I know this. It does not make it any easier, though. And because they tell you to suppress, you have no outlet. So you keep it in. And yet it's supposed to be let out. So after my father died, I began to write poetry that led to fiction. And everything comes full circle because the fiction I wrote are the same folklore that my father would tell me. And I did this because I realized that our culture has been so demonized, and yet there is nothing demonic about it. If I say the word for Zimbabweans, if I say the word Hari, some of you, the first thing you think of is witchcraft. That's the first thing you think of, witchcraft. And yet, there are literally different types of haris. One for soup, one for meat, one for traditional beer, one for water, one for sadza. That's what they were used for. And if you don't believe me, you can go visit Great Zimbabwe and see some of the earliest haris we had from over 300 years ago. Most of you, if you're Zimbabwean, you know that in the month of November, you don't get married. Do any of you know why? And yet it's such a prominent part of our culture because whether you like it or not, you will not get married in November. You will get married alone if you want to force issues. Your family won't be there though. And it is because they believe that our ancestors would have gone to the Almighty Creator during this period to ask on your behalf for either a very good year and the wisdom to guide you through it, or the strength to guide you through a challenging year. Now, if you go and you have Aurora, which is a celebration, you're bringing in a man into their home and saying, this is your son-in-law, and yet there's no one, that is an insult. It is similar to getting married without your parents. You just wake up one day and you say, hey, let's go. And your parents don't know. And then you tell them, oh, by the way, Mom, I got married today. If you're a parent, how do you think you're going to react? You're going to be like, excuse me? This better be a joke. So it's the same concept. You get married in November and they're not there. It's the same concept. And these are the things that I put into writing because one of the issues that we've had is that our tradition was orally passed. The problem with that is there's a famous saying, when an old man dies, a library burns to the ground. How many of our elders have died with information that we need about ourselves? Now, culture itself is the social behaviors and norms of a particular kind of people. And I like to say that our culture is our identity. Without culture, we have no identity. And without no identity, you do not know who you are. That's where you see yourself easily latching onto somebody else's culture, but that's not you. It will never be you, no matter how hard you try. Now, the first issue to tackle is always representation. Because like I said, as a little girl, growing up around the world, the books I read were fascinating, but I never came across my name. I never came across even the capital city. I never came across any of that. And the narrative needs to change, whereby our children can be so happy that there's a girl called Runako in that book. She comes from Nyanga. I come from Nyanga. The more they relate to a character, the more likely they are to want to read the books. Because they know they can find themselves and their children and their friends in these books. Now, there are many ways to preserve culture, and language is one of them. Like I said previously, we have 16 official languages, and yet in our schools, it's only English and Shona. That's a big problem in itself. Because if I'm a Ndau girl and I come into a school and you're teaching me English, but I'm struggling a little bit, and it would be helpful if I had something backed up in Ndau to help me compare the words, I can't even find that. And it is something that we as a society need to look at. Have literature in the different dialects in libraries. Have applications that children can actually go on and look and actually select that they want to speak Kalanga. That's how they learn. Then they can see the similarities between this Karanga word and this Kalanga word. Have explainers on YouTube, you know. I'm pretty sure if you have nieces or nephews or children or grandkids, everybody knows Cocomelon. Yeah, we all know that. They like to play it on repeat, but we need our own version of that actually teaches them. Because it's all fine that you know Cocomelon, but you need to know something about yourself. Even the importance of a name. In our tradition and culture, we believe that your name, the name you gift your child, is the first blessing you ever give them. It's the first blessing you ever give them. 9 times out of 10, you embody what your name means. As was said, my name is Chengeto Rufaro or Rufaro Chengeto, either way, and it literally means to keep happiness, the keeper of happiness. Those who know me will understand that I literally embody my name. You know, culture starts from that very first, when the baby takes their very first breath and you decide, I'm going to call her Chiedza, which means dawn, it means light. You're speaking light into her life, right? But now she needs to stand firm in who she is. She can't do that if she doesn't know who she is. Acknowledging our sacred months or certain dates is another way in preserving culture. I admire the Chinese New Year without fail. The number 4, if I'm not mistaken, they don't put it in their elevators because it means death. The Indians, they've got Diwali, they've got all of these things. You know. And yet here, if you look at our calendar and take away any holiday related to the war, what is our national holiday? Anyone? Nothing. Right. Embarrassing, right? Because you go in a group of other people and they're telling you, in our country we have this, in our country we have that. In your country, what do you have? Yeah. And yet it is known that in August there's something called Kuroa Gua, which means hitting the grave, which is basically bringing in the spirit of the deceased into the rural homes that they can rest with their ancestors. This is a process that is done throughout August. November, everybody knows it's taboo to get married in that month. Technically speaking, the new year starts after your ancestors come back, which is in December. These are things that no one knows, and yet if you put them on the calendar, someone will know. Pick a specific date, then you know that, okay, this date is the one that signifies that we have entered the month of this, and it is a holiday that we're going to put to honor our people and the way that we were before. Yesterday during orientation, I asked the question, there was the Zimbabwean flag. And I asked the question, does anyone know what the bird is for? Anyone? I think my TED talk is like proving its point. If you go to Great Zimbabwe, right, you'll find that in one of the rooms, they have soap beams that have been molded after the hungwe. The hungwe is the raptor series, so your eagle, your hawk, your falcon, that kind of bird, right? And every single time a king died, they would create one in honor of him. Now, when we were beginning to be colonized, 7 of those birds, there were 8. 7 of these birds went out of the country. 1 stayed behind. We managed to get the 7 back. The Zimbabwean flag, the bird was molded after the one bird that never left Zimbabwe, that was never touched. That's the one they molded this bird out of. Now, hungwe is Zimbabwean, which is the ancestor of the country, the spirit of the country. That's what it's called. It represents everything spiritual. It goes hand in hand with a dish that has a crocodile, which represents those walking on land and underwater. That's where our emblem comes from, not the colors, the bird. And this is something that not even your children will know, and yet we're all supposed to be ambassadors of this country in one way or another. There are certain people who may want to give you opportunities, and then they ask, tell me something interesting about Zimbabwe. And you don't even know anything interesting. You don't even know, not one fact. And that shows that that disconnect is there, and it needs to be reconnected. While our great-grandparents and grandparents, for those who are lucky, are still alive, get their stories, write them down, put them on the internet so that we can find them. You may ask what I'm doing in order to help this. And my books are based on Zimbabwean mythology, traditions, customs, and culture. I write in a manner that makes you interested. I do not lecture, because as I said before, lectures have never worked on me, and they hardly ever work on anybody else. I make you curious. I don't give you all the information. Look for it yourself. Get interested. Get curious. Because there is so much to be proud of in this country. So much to be proud of. And when you're proud of these things, that's when you begin to want to change your community. You begin to want to change your surroundings. And it is very important, but before you can do that, you have to be proud of being Zimbabwean first. So I would like you to just go home and find 5 facts that you didn't know. Just 5 about Zimbabwe. If it means you're booking a trip to Kariba and actually having a guide with you who actually explains the history of the place, then so be it. Because we cannot have people who are not Zimbabwean know more about Zimbabwean than Zimbabweans. That does not make sense at all. And culture is our identity. Our identity is who we are. If we do not have culture, you do not know who you are. Ask yourself the question, what does your identity stand like right now? And I'll end with this quote. It's very simple. Tsika dziraswe, which basically means your culture, your customs, you don't throw them away. You never can. Because one way or another, your life will be led back to the very beginning. Thank you.